Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. How is everybody? I'm Skip Reimer, Executive Director of Events and Communications here at the Milken Institute, and welcome to our first Milken Institute Forum since our global conference, which was a wonderful experience. If you were unable to make that, please note that videos from all of the sessions, along with photographs and slides we created, are all on our website. Just go to globalconference.org. Only 160 hours of viewing pleasure. Let you know our next forum will be Thursday, June 12th, when Louisa Lim, she is the NPR's Beijing correspondent, will talk about her new book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, which is, as humorous as that sounds, is about the protests in Tiananmen Square 25 years ago next month. That is again on Thursday, June 12th. A couple of notes on today's forum. Number one, the book, The Fourth Revolution, is for sale with our friends in Barnes & Noble over there. I'm sure our authors would appreciate it if you bought a copy or two. And afterward, they will stay behind to sign copies of your book if you'd like. Secondly, we do take all of our questions electronically. We do have a couple of microphones if you left your iPad at home. But if you put up that slide, you can text or email us at those numbers and URL in front of you. You can do that anytime. And once they're done with their opening remarks, we'll go to questions. So we're delighted to have two of the world's most respected journalists with us today, both coming from what many agree is one of the preeminent publications covering current events today, and that's The Economist. They are John Micklethwait, the editor-in-chief and former U.S. editor. He is on the right. And Adrian Wooldridge, who is the managing editor and the former Washington bureau chief, who now writes also the paper's Schumpeter column. Did I pronounce that correctly? This is their fifth book together, and despite the fact that they're now both back in London, they continue to be fascinated by American society, our economics, our politics, and now with their new book, our government, and we are all better off for their wonderful observations and insights. Their new book has a bold thesis that we are in the midst of a new revolution in government and that the West is being left behind. As the two of them wrote recently in a Wall Street Journal essay provocatively titled, "Can China Best the West?" at Statecraft, they wrote, "Just as China deliberately set out to remaster the art of capitalism, it is now trying to remaster the art of government. The only difference is a chilling one. Many Chinese think there is far less to be gained from studying Western government than they did from studying Western capitalism. They visit Silicon Valley and Wall Street, not Washington." It is a timely and valuable book. We're delighted to have them with us today. They're going to do a little tag team discussion, and then we'll open up to questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Micklethwait and Adrian Wooldridge.
Which seat we were sitting in. We have to be either on the right or the left. It's a political choice. I should say the way that we want to structure this is that we would like to have a conversation. For those of you who are involved in journalism in any way, those are deeply chilling and foreboding words, because it is always pretty much shorthand for whatever a politician says when they have absolutely nothing to say. There was a moment on the last campaign when Mitt Romney suddenly announced he wanted to have a conversation with the American people, and you sensed he was doomed. But in this case, it's an honest entreaty. We would like to provoke you in various ways for about 35 minutes, and then we are happy to take questions on anything, principally the book, but also if you want to ask us about other things in a fit of arrogance or conceit, we're happy to do that too. Our book, really, the clue or the best starting point is the subtitle, The Fourth Revolution, the global race to reinvent the state, the global race to reinvent the state. If you're in business, you'll know that the worst form of contest to be in is one where you don't know you're in a contest. Sears Roebuck thought it was just battling against Montgomery Ward. It didn't think that you had Walmart coming up behind it, didn't think about what would happen in terms of Amazon. Our view of America at the moment, and the West in general, is that it is in much the same set. If you look at what's happening, and you're going to see it in Europe this weekend, you're going to see people trooping off to the polls with what I would describe as a kind of virulent apathy. They are very, very cross, very, very cross, and you will see this again in the midterms in America. People are absolutely furious with their government. They are angry and cross, but they are also deeply apathetic about the prospect of change. If you ask anybody whether their government's going to change, they just say no. And it is not just a matter of voters. I think it's also a matter of the elites. Most politicians, and we spend a lot of time visiting them, give some sort of version of the same reply that one European politician gave when asked about what they were doing in Europe, which was, we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get elected once we've done it. And that, I think, is what you hear actually from senators. Senators say, yeah, we know what we should do about entitlements, but we're not prepared to do it. Why? What do we offer that? We think that is fundamentally wrong. Fundamentally wrong. It is absolutely untrue that Western government is going to stay the same. Why do we think that? For a variety of reasons, but just to put the two main ones in front of you. If you really find it comprehensible that the private sector can get changed completely by technology over the previous 50 years, and yet the public sector will somehow remain immune to that, then maybe you're right, maybe nothing really will change. But the other reason, a big, big reason, is history. History shows us, and this book particularly, we lay it out in great detail, that Western government has not stayed the same. It has been through a whole series of huge revolutions. Indeed, we would argue the surprising thing would be in 20 years' time, if you look back at this particular age and said, well, actually nothing did change, you would absolutely expect it in a time of great technological change and where there has not been a basic revolution in Western government for really 100 years. That, in a sense, is the good reason, the good thing we can tell people. The bad thing is very much, as Skip said at the beginning, is that this time there is a big difference. Previously, the West could make these decisions by itself, but now this time it is in competition. It is in competition particularly with Asia, because out there are people thinking very hard about government, and they, unlike the people in Washington, and to a large extent, unlike the people in Sacramento, have a very, very real sense that they are in competition. So what were those three revolutions that I described? What were those three revolutions which the West did jump ahead of the rest of the world? I'll turn it over to Adrian.
The first revolution was the rise of the nation state in the 16th and 17th centuries. The great achievement of this revolution was to provide internal security for people, and the great philosopher of this revolution was Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan. One of the most remarkable things was that when Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, you'd have to be an absolute madman to think that the future of the world lay in Europe. The future of the world surely lay in the Ottoman Empire, in India, or, most important of all, in China. In 1588, there were only 3 cities in Europe which had populations of more than 300,000. That was the population of the Forbidden City in Peking alone. And many of those 300,000 people in Peking were philosopher kings. Mandarin intellectuals had been selected by a sophisticated process of examinations from all over this vast kingdom. So it looks as though China is massively ahead of Europe. Europe, by contrast, is a blood-soaked backwater. When Hobbes was born, life was really nasty, brutish, and short, as he said in Leviathan. He was born during the prematurely because his mother was convinced that the Armada, the Spanish Armada, was about to land. So she was terrified into giving birth to him. And Hobbes himself said, "Fear and I were born as twins together." Hobbes spent much of his life in exile. He wrote Leviathan in exile because of the English Civil War. And the English Civil War was a war in which a higher proportion of the population were killed than in the First World War. So this is a very frightening, anarchic place. But what happens during his lifetime is that the state begins to establish internal order. It begins to get the robber barons, the feudal barons under control. It begins to get religious disputes out of politics. It begins to provide a modicum of law and order. But it does so internally in a way that preserves competition with other states. China is such a huge empire, such an internally focused empire, that there's no real competition going on. When the Chinese invent gunpowder, they use it for fireworks. When the Europeans invent gunpowder, they use it to blast each other out of the oceans, which may be a terrible thing, but that's how society developed. When at the beginning of the 16th century, a Chinese emperor creates a decree that everybody in the country must move everybody on the southern coast must move 17 miles inland because he doesn't want them contaminated by trade. On the other hand, of course, the Europeans at that time are expanding around the world. They're creating empires, empires of power, empires of trade. So this combination of internal order, which provides people with a sense of security, and external competition and expansion creates a very dynamic focus of power, which really lays down the rules of the world. So that's the first revolution. The second revolution is the liberal revolution of the late 18th and 19th centuries. A revolution that is based on the idea of accountability of governors to the political classes, liberty, preserving a central core of liberty, and some sort of representation, and certainly a great deal of efficiency. This is the revolution which you probably here would associate in the late 18th century with the American Revolution. This is a revolution which the French would associate with their French Revolution, but I'm going to associate with what happens in England in that period, partly because I think that the American Revolution was a bit of a mistake, something eventually to be rectified when you guys all see sense and return to the great benevolent rule of the Windsor family. And partly because the French are French. They do their thing. But more seriously, because England at that time was the America of the 19th century. England was the superpower that laid down the rules for the rest of the world, that created the trends that the rest of the world looked towards. And England was also the vortex, the center of the Industrial Revolution, the great technological transformation of that time. So England really matters. And what happens in England in that time is something absolutely remarkable. And that is that you get a state that shrinks, but also gets more efficient. In 1815, the British taxation rate is £80 million. They take £80 million to run the state. By 1846, you're creating new services, you're creating a police force, you're creating a sanitation system, you're providing much more than you've ever provided before, and you reduce taxation to £60 million a year. You're actually reducing the state at the time that you're providing more efficient services. How do you do that? How do you pull off this remarkable thing? The most important reason is you get rid of rent-seeking, patronage, sinecures. In the 18th century, the state was old corruption. It just looked after itself. It was a blood-sucking beast. You get rid of that and replace it by meritocratic civil servants who are selected actually to do a job rather than just to claim rents. That's the first thing. The second thing is you relentlessly pursue the aim of efficiency. So William Gladstone, who was Prime Minister for much of this period, talked about saving candle ends and cheese pairings for the good of the country. Constantly do everything as leanly and efficiently as possible. So you have an extraordinary situation in which, because of efficiency, because of meritocratic government, because of getting rid of patronage and self-serving, you're shrinking the state whilst improving it. And that becomes this, what we call in the book, lean government liberalism, becomes the sort of template for the rest of the world. America is very much influenced by this sort of idea. And I remember reading an article in the Democratic Review from the mid-19th century, which says that what we need is a government that does the least possible thing. He who governs least governs best, it says. And it lists a number of things that government must never, on any account, ever attempt to do. Running the post office, appalling. Running prisons and lunatic asylums, appalling, never do it. And inspecting bakeries. They said, if this happens, that's the end of civilization. So you're moving towards a much smaller government. Then, after the middle of the 19th century, things begin to change in some quite interesting ways, partly because of a sense of compassion. You have people saying, wait a minute, this is a bit too hard-headed. Wait a minute, you've got people who are left in poverty, who are not helped by the state. You get Charles Dickens writing Hard Times. You get John Stuart Mill, who is the great prophet of lean government liberalism, the great author of On Liberty in 1859, which said that nobody can interfere with the rights of the individual, saying, actually, you need to provide a national minimum of education. You need to provide people with better opportunities, drifting towards a sense that government has more obligations than just to preserve freedom. Secondly, you have problems coming from a notion of national efficiency. People saying that actually for a country to be efficient, for a country to be successful in the competition of powers, you need a more active role of the state. And so the British particularly are looking at Germany. They're looking at Prussia and saying, well, wait a minute, Prussia has got a really first-class education system. Prussia's got a really first-class university system. Prussia is beginning to dominate the new economy of the late 19th century, which is the economy of engineering and the economy of chemistry. So we must have a more activist state to keep up with this. And at one point, Lloyd George, one of the great liberals, says we can't have an A1 empire equipped with a C3 population. We must improve the quality of the population in order to be powerful. And this lays the foundations of what we call the third revolution, which is the welfare state revolution. The beginning of the 19th century, you begin to construct a welfare state, partly because of these notions of efficiency, partly because of these notions of compassion, which sort of fuse together. The great prophets of this are Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who argue that the state is the embodiment of reason, the state can plan, the state can think ahead, the state is a benevolent agency. They set up the New Statesman, and by extension, they helped to set up the New Republic in the United States to spread this doctrine. They set up the London School of Economics to perpetrate this idea and to train new civil servants to run the new bureaucracy. And they generally talk up the idea of big government. And from then on, from 1900 right the way for the rest of the century, you have an incremental growth in the power of the state. And this really begins to speed up in 1945 with the notion of the New Jerusalem in Britain, the Labour Party trying to create a New Jerusalem with free national health service, free education up to the age of 16, and after that, a much expanded education system, university system. It begins to gather momentum, of course, in America, first of all with the New Deal, but even more so with the Great Society, the anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's speech, about which we celebrate tomorrow. And the idea is that the state must provide more than just a fair chance in life. It must intervene to end poverty. It must intervene to end inequality. It must intervene to make everybody live a culturally rich life. And this is extraordinarily successful. This set of ideas is extraordinarily successful for a long time. You have in Britain, as Harold Macmillan said, the idea that you've never had it so good. True. You have in France the 20 glorious years of economic expansion. True. You have in Germany the post-war miracle, a remarkable period of expansion. But by the 1970s, things begin to go into decline. You have the terrible failure of the Vietnam War, the idea that this mighty state in America can't fight the Vietnam War. You have the war on poverty beginning to fail, in a sense that not only is it not conquering poverty, but in some ways it's creating lots of perverse incentives. You have crime beginning to spread in the inner cities and beyond in the United States. You have industrial relations falling apart. In Britain, it seemed as though the country was literally ungovernable. Endless strikes, endless strife, endless discord. And you have stagflation. You have New York almost going bankrupt, sense that the whole country was falling apart. And you have a general sense of appalling moral decay. And of all the things that happened in that period, the worst and most appalling happened in a sauna in San Francisco and involved 4 men, one of whom is here today.
It is sadly true. San Francisco, which I might point out to Adrian's earlier joke, is that a wonderful Englishman called Francis Drake landed here in the 15th century and founded a country which he called Nova Albion, which rather stupidly the Spanish then changed to California. But that would have completed things. No, in 1980, I arrived as a student on what in Britain we call our gap year, which is a bit before you go to university. And I was traveling around with a friend, and he had a cousin, an elderly cousin, who lived in San Francisco. And we went to go and stay with him. And he was an older man called Anthony Fisher, who had made a lot of money in Britain out of chickens and then run away or to escape the high taxes. And he persuaded us to go and have a sauna with the man who lived in his apartment block called Milton. And we sat there having this exotic experience to us, whilst this, as far as I got, rather mad, small man began to pester us and said, where are you? You're from Britain. Margaret Thatcher's come in. I know her. And she's going to change it. She's going to start privatising British Rail. She's going to start opening up British Telecom. And there's something called monetarism is going to come in. And she's going to start doing vouchers for education. And I sort of sat there and looked at this man and thought, this is absolutely mad. I've just come from Yorkshire, northern Yorkshire, where I've had to be kind of taught in my school. The lights went off because the miners' strike. You're taught by candlelight sometimes. This seemed so completely weird. And later in that trip, I went to watch the Grateful Dead play. And I remember thinking nothing that I saw on stage there was half as hallucinogenic as this madman in the sauna. And of course, the madman was Milton Friedman. And it turned out that he was correct about quite a lot of these things. What he was not correct about entirely was this, what we describe as a half revolution, which is Reagan, Thatcher, and the general push of what Milton Friedman was about. In one way, there's no doubt that it worked. The state was pushed out of business, particularly dramatically in Europe, first under Margaret Thatcher in Britain, but actually a lot afterwards in the 1990s, particularly in continental Europe, and then actually increasingly all the way around the rest of the world. If you see what happened in Latin America, if you see what happened in Eastern Europe, this was very much, yet again, the idea of the West as a ferment of new ideas and changing things, the Washington Consensus. The second way in which Reagan and Thatcher won was really, they won the argument. I mean, it's noticeable, tomorrow will be the anniversary of the Great Society. It is noticeable how few people anywhere now would dare really to put forward the idea that big government, a nation of planners is the answer. Reagan's point that government was the problem, not the solution, is part of the rhetoric of just about everybody. If you look at Kerry, you look at Gore, they disown the phrase big government liberal so quickly. Obama's occasionally flirted with some of the Great Society ideas, but never gone anywhere near it. Bill Clinton, the age of big government is over. Rhetorically, the ideas of Milton Friedman won. But the reason why it's only a half revolution is just because of reality. Look at the numbers. They did not stop the state growing in any seismic way, any way really at all. Margaret Thatcher spent 10 years in power, 10 tumultuous years. And at the end of it, she had reduced welfare spending as a proportion of GDP from 22.9% all the way down to 22.2%. And it promptly went back up again. And things, yes, they changed a bit under Bill Clinton, who kept things down. We have to give him credit for that. And so did Tony Blair originally, just to use those two countries. But soon you had another splurge. George Bush, as we all know, famously increased spending more than anybody since LBJ. Back in Britain, you had Gordon Brown. Throughout Europe, you had this amazing increase in spending, which helped now in some ways to cause the problems with the euro. But it's not just to do with the size of the state. It's also to do with regulations. It's to do with the other things. Sidney Webb, who Adrian mentioned, was the son of a barber. But even he might have been vaguely shocked. Even his dream of an ever-expanding Leviathan might have been faintly curtailed by the idea that if you go to Florida, and I think it's also true of California, if you want to be a hairdresser, you have to spend 2 years studying the arts of blow drying and so on in order to get a license. Even more amazing, you have to spend 2 years studying to get a license to be an interior decorator. Whatever Leviathan was meant to do, it was not meant to prevent you having clashing colour schemes in your sitting room. if you look at the house where George Orwell wrote 1984, around that now, the flat where he did, there's now 42 closed circuit cameras, another way in which the state has expanded. The night watchman state, famously the phrase we'd associate with John Stuart Mill, has now become a nanny state. That is really what we're used to. What Adrian described as that welfare state has kept on going. It's really effectively 100 years old now, in the same way as the Great Society is 50 years old. And the reason is that both sides keep on pushing it. This is not just a thing to do with the left. Yes, the left asks for more prisons, for more hospitals and more schools. The right asks for more prisons. It asks for more military spending. They both ask for all forms of regulation. Some regulations come to you from the New York Times and The Guardian. Other ones are called for by the Daily Mail and Fox News, particularly ones to do with anything to do with terrorism and things like that. But underneath it, and California is a great example, just look at the years and years of voter initiatives here. You give people a chance to ask for stuff, they keep on asking for more. They want to have more to spend. This is the era, really, of more. And that the reason, in the end, comes back to us. In the book, we describe the way in which we all think about this is that we're effectively a bit like Augustus Gloop, the boy in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who just wants more and more chocolate, and eventually it kills him. Or he dies from overeating, and one might put it that way. The ever bigger state has really basically been the biggest reality of all our lives. There is nobody in this room who has not lived with that sense. If you look at the numbers, it has grown throughout every one of our years, and is kept on, not always, some years it's gone down a little bit, but the overall trend, it has always kept on going up throughout the entire period in every single Western country. But, and we would argue this very passionately, one rule comes back. There was an economist called Herb Stein who set down one starting point, which is if, it's meant to be a joke by economic standards, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. That is quite a good way to introduce Adrian, who will now...
And I do promise at some point I will stop. But why do we believe that there will be a fourth revolution? Indeed, that we're seeing the beginning of the fourth revolution, when we've lived in a world for so long in which the state has only got bigger, only got more intrusive, and only got more dysfunctional. One reason, of course, is Stein's rule, that it will stop. The state has been overspending for decades. Since the economic crisis in 2007, McKinsey calculates that that governments have borrowed $16 trillion. Before that, of course, they were borrowing like crazy. The idea behind Keynesian economics was always that you would stimulate the economy in times of economic recession or economic crisis in order to make up for a lack of private sector demand. That was a response to crisis. What we've had now is government spending as a condition of life every year, regardless of the situation. America has run 5 surpluses since 1960. The French, my beloved friends, have not run a surplus since 1975. This has become as though you're addicted to steroids, that you're taking them all the time, whether you're ill or whether you're not ill, and it's very, very bad for the system. It's particularly bad for the system when you have an aging population. We're going to see the retirement of the baby boomers here. We have an even more serious problem in Europe with the aging of the population. So we're coming towards an entitlement crisis that means the old state of gloopism, the old state of more and more and more, cannot go on. But also, there is a more positive reason why things will change. There is a huge opportunity here to make the state better, to make the state more efficient, to make it more responsive. There's an opportunity from better management. The state is hopelessly out of date. In some ways, the state at the moment is stuck in the agricultural age. The American school year is 180 days. There is this long, long summer holiday. The reason for this long summer holiday, when most of our children forget everything they've learned, is so they can go out and bring in the harvests, help with the harvest. This is an agricultural mentality. There aren't that many people who actually need them to do that in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, or Washington. The second way in which the state is stuck is it's stuck in the industrial age. It's stuck in the age of huge vertical integration in which the which it has to own everything that it provides, own every service. It was the case, Henry Ford used to say, he had to own the fields upon which grazed the sheep, which provided the wool that went into the cars that he was selling. That is exactly the mentality of much of the public sector at the moment. It doesn't contract things out. And thirdly, it's stuck in this dysfunctional decade of the 1970s. There's lots of about the public sector that seems very 1970s about it. I think in San Bernardino, which went bankrupt recently, the city attorney said to people when he laid off all of the police force, he said, lock your doors and load your guns. That's the only sort of law enforcement we're going to have here. And that sort of dysfunctional 1970s feel is extremely worrying, I think. So just learning a little bit from the private sector, learning to contract out much more, learning to publish results, publish performance tables, make sure that people understand how well other people are performing will do a huge amount. For example, why is it that California spends very significantly more on schools than Finland, very significantly more on schools than Singapore, but performs much worse? I think just knowing that, knowing the different metrics is extremely important. Another important management lesson you can have is by looking around the world and seeing how people elsewhere are doing things to try and improve your performance. There's an extraordinary heart surgeon in Bangalore called Devi Shetty, who has a huge heart hospital there with 1,000 beds. And that heart hospital provides as good a service as anywhere in America. It can provide a heart operation for $2,000. Here it is at least $100,000. Looked at by Harvard Medical Schools, you get exactly the same performance quality because he has innovated the way in which he's providing this service. He's using a lot more people who are non-surgeons to do non-essential things so that the surgeons can concentrate on the most important things. LifeSpring Hospitals in India is delivering babies for $40 a piece. Aravind Eye Hospital is providing eye operations. It provides 70% of the eye operations provided by the National Health Service a year at 1% of the cost. All of this is through innovation of service. So just by using good management, you can hugely improve things. But there's something much more important going on at the moment, and that is opportunity. That is the technological revolution that's going on. In the 19th century, we saw a dramatic improvement of productivity in the manufacturing sector because of the Industrial Revolution. What we're going to see now, what we are seeing now, is a dramatic improvement of productivity in the service sector because of the information revolution. And that is basically, the public sector is a service sector. So we can see dramatic efficiency improvements. Instead of having one lecturer lecturing to a class of 100 people, you could have one of the best lecturers in the world. You could have Isaiah Berlin lecturing to 1 million people across the internet. And you can actually now, the quality of these lectures is so good over the internet that you are there with Isaiah Berlin talking. You can have extraordinary changes in the way that classrooms are organized. All the chalk and talk, all the transmission of basic ideas can be done through iPads, can be done through the internet, freeing the teachers to give personal attention to pupils. The Khan Academy, Bill Gates sends his children to the Khan Academy to do their homework. That is available to everybody, whatever their background, however rich they are. So incredible technological changes. Telemedicine, over the phone, you can consult doctors over the phone. Doctors can look at you through computer screens. Sensors, the Internet of Things can monitor your health so you don't have to keep going to you don't have to wait till you break down and people look at you. You can be constantly monitored and they can see when you're going to have an attack. This is completely transforming what is the basis of the public sector. Crime. Enormous reductions in crime in places like New York because of the use of information technology, information to tell police where to go, where the crimes are happening, so they can respond immediately and swarm into areas of high crime. So there is a fantastic potential going on for this fourth revolution. It is stirring up. Now, many people will say, and we've heard this on our tour in the last week, it can't be done. You just can't do these things. It's pie in the sky. Well, I remember going to New York in the 1980s, and it seemed like a city that was falling apart. It seemed like a very, very dangerous place to be. And Giuliani organized a police revolution, which completely changed it and turned it into a relatively safe city. I remember reading a lot of articles about a state not very far from here, a few years ago, saying California can never be fixed. It's the Greece of the United States. It's going to go bankrupt. You're now running a budget surplus. You've had a lot. You've got problems, of course, but you've really turned around in a lot of ways. Sweden. I remember people saying that Sweden was the quintessential example of big government. Government could only get bigger. Taxes could only go up further. This is Fabianism gone mad. Well, in 1993, the Swedes had a revolution. At that point, 67% of GDP went on public spending. It's now 49% of GDP, a massive reduction in public spending. In 1993, the top rate of tax was basically 100% for very, very successful people. They've reduced the taxation rate by 27 points. It's not that different from what you have in Britain. You've reduced corporation tax to well below American levels. You've got rid of inheritance tax. You've simplified the tax code. You've had a huge overhaul of the retirement system, so they've raised retirement age along with life expectancies to create a balanced budget for years and years to come. So the Swedes, the big government socialists, have shrunk their state. They've improved their state in terms of its long-term balance, and they've done something even more remarkable than that. They have created an entrepreneurial welfare revolution. They've opened their welfare state to competition. They say basically, we are a social democratic society. All public services should be free at the point of use, but that doesn't mean that they have to be provided by public sector workers. So they've introduced universal school vouchers. The man that John had a sauna with. He may have had a shower with, I don't know. The man in the sauna who talked about school vouchers, that dream of school vouchers was realized not in the United States, but in Sweden. You have private sector companies running schools, running chains of schools. You have private sector companies running hospitals in that country. Welfare entrepreneurship used as a way of delivering services better. People say, well, you can do this, but you can only do it by hurting the poor. We have to defend the state as it is because that's the only way you can help the poor. Well, I think that's nonsense. There are a lot of ways in which the state doesn't help the poor in this country, but actually uses public spending or foregone taxation to help the rich. You have $1.3 trillion in loopholes and exemptions. That's 8% of GDP for the tax code, distorted towards the rich. You have vast amounts of mortgage interest relief. We spend more, you spend more on mortgage interest relief for the top 5% of people in the country than you do for social housing for people at the bottom of society. You have a Department of Agriculture which exists to support gentlemen farmers rather than really to help the economy at all. So you have really lots of ways in which you have corporate crony capitalism helping the rich rather than helping the poor. The state has become distorted. So good management, good technology can absolutely revolutionize the state. But I think you need to also begin to ask yourself, what is the state for? What should we be doing? What should the state be doing? And what should it not do? What should it keep out of? We think actually shrinking the state would be good for democracy because the state has got too big, it's got too all-encompassing. And by being too big, it creates a sense not only of dependency, but of disillusionment. People want more. Then the state tries to provide it, but doesn't do it very well, becomes too sprawling. So you have this extraordinary democratic distemper, which we see all around the world. On the one hand, people asking the state to solve its problems. On the other hand, they turn around and say, well, you didn't do it very well, and they feel this strange thing that John said, which is sort of perpetual apathetic discontent with the world that they've got. So we actually think democracy would be hugely strengthened by having a more focused state that promised to do the right things and didn't promise to do everything. We also think that liberty is being endangered by the current sprawling state. I don't think it's right that the state should take so much of our money. I don't think it's right that the state should regulate things that don't need to be regulated and tell you how long you need to take to learn to braid hair. And I particularly don't think it's right that there should be 1 million people in America with national security, high security clearances. I don't think it's right that the state should be monitoring our lives, our communications, our email. It's not just the right, it's the left that has gone mad here. The left has created a Leviathan which is taking too much of our money. The right has created a Leviathan which is intruding into us in the name of national security all the time. So I think we need to go back and consult the great thinkers such as John Stuart Mill about liberty and about the efficiency of having a smaller, more focused state. But also, I think fundamentally, we have to look around the world as well to realize that for the past 500 years, as I said, the West's had the game to itself. It's been the vortex of creativity. It's been capable of keeping the world as its oyster. Now, there is real competition going on, and there is a real alternative. We have got flabby, and some parts of the rest of the world have become incredibly efficient in this area. And John is going to talk about one of the most frightening aspects of this.
We will end soon and ask you for your questions, but the big difference between this one and everything that has gone before it is that this time we are in competition. If you look around the world, you look for good government, you don't necessarily, as you've heard in many parts of what Adrian has just said, you go to India and you look at hospitals there, you go and look at Singapore, you go and look at Chile, and if you want a particular place that symbolizes this, it is the place that we begin the book with. It is located on the outskirts of Shanghai and is called CELAP, or the China Executive Leadership Academy at Pudong. And you approach it, and it has sort of barbed wire around the outside, and it looks a bit military. Once you get inside, it feels like Harvard, but sort of Harvard as redesigned by Dr. No. In the middle, you have a large sort of scarlet desk, I mean, easily the size of this building, and with an inkwell beside it. And the locals call this a cadre training school, and they're right. This is for people who are going to become ambassadors, this is people who are going to run state-owned companies. These are up-and-coming bureaucrats within China compete to go to this place. And it is basically trying to ask one question, is what works in government? The Chinese discovered that they could do very well at capitalism by 20, 25 years ago, going off and studying and seeing what the West did well. So they sent people to Silicon Valley, they sent people to Wall Street, they sent people to the City of London and to the Mittelstand in Germany. This time round, they will turn around the other way. They will decide what to do about government. And when they set out to do that, the interesting thing is just look at the places they go to. They go to the places that we've been talking about. They do go to Chile, they do go to Iceland. They occasionally, they now say they might come to California. They certainly do not go to Washington because they think there's very little they can actually learn about things that really work well there. Just the wrong way to put it. The place which, interestingly, they see most as a model is Singapore. And you can see a whole series of rather bad reasons why that might be true. It's all the authoritarian element, the kind of you can't spit chewing gum out on the street element. But there is also a very basic point. You know, look at Singapore. We couldn't come up with any service that America or Britain or the West provides that isn't done dramatically better and dramatically cheaper by Singapore. And you can say, oh, Singapore is terribly small, and you'd be right. But Athens was terribly small, and that's what mattered when it came to democracy. And virtually all the things that Singapore does do are to some extent replicable. It is not exactly authoritarian to go out and try and find really good teachers and actually pay them more if they are good and sack them if they're bad. It isn't exactly authoritarian to say, well, look, if you're going to run the civil service and you're going to do this very well, we'll pay you $2 million a year. Now, that is a very difficult pill to swallow for the right in America, which tends to think that all government is evil and has to be put down. But if you really want a small government, you actually want someone at the top who can run it competently and drive it in that direction. By the same token, at the bottom, they give as much choice and as much power to people at the bottom as possible. Now, that is what the Chinese are looking at. That is what they are trying to learn from. They're not necessarily doing it right, they're not necessarily doing it in the right direction, but they are trying to compete. And that goes right the way back to what we started with. America is in a competition with another area, and whether we like it or not, and so is Europe and the West. And that is what we have to fight. And what we are arguing in this book, in some ways, is hopeful. We are saying, look, you are likely to be on the edge of a big revolution. But we're also saying, watch out, because there is another alternative. We argue that on the whole, most of the good arguments are still with democracy. But democracy, as Adrian said, has got tatty, it's got shabby, and it needs to be renovated. That is the core, and if it does that, it can do much better. But until then, it's going to be a much, much closer race than we might otherwise have thought. And on that note, both hopefully pessimistic and inspiring, we will turn to you for your questions. Thank you very much. Yes? Oh, sorry, there's a microphone coming.
Let's answer questions.
Oh, sorry, we meant to
Everybody
also...
is aware
We'll take you first, and then we'll take this.
There's a big controversy here, I don't know if you heard about it in Europe, about net neutrality. And there are people right now, if you are aware of this, who want you to pay to be on the internet. And it's a big controversy right now, and I think it's something that should be looked at properly. Also, what do you think now, what do you think of what I call corporate welfare? I don't know if you're aware of it, you didn't mention anything, but many of the top corporations in this country don't pay any income tax. Talk about cutting taxes, okay? What do you think about that? Last but not least, you already mentioned some things that I think are useful as far as, I think, reinforcing good behavior, very simple, for people who are competent to the system. But are you familiar with the internet neutrality debate right now?
We go the internet neutrality debate. We can go through. When I take the ones which are more directly on the subject, the one immediately about the corporate welfare, I would take. I think you possibly weren't listening very closely. When we talked about $1.3 trillion worth of tax exemptions, those are absolutely going to. When we denounce everything to do with cronyism, that is absolutely to do with that. The great problem on the right in America is a very simple one. Is you have the Republican Party and it's got two problems. One is that it has, as I said, an element whereby it just automatically thinks the state is bad, which means it is unable to do something like pick somebody very good to run something like the veterans hospitals and pay them a lot of money to do it well, and you can see the consequences of that at the moment. And the second problem is that it is in bed with a large amount of particularly corporations and rich people. If you look at what we said about the tax break for mortgage interest relief, again, why give people $1 million mortgages a way to do that, whilst on the same time on the other side coming back and not giving stuff to the poor? That is not what they're meant to do. I'm being told that we should answer some questions from the thing. So Adrian, do you want to read this out?
Yes.
And then
I'm going to, the first question here, it's a very good question, is your answer is to break down representative democracy. Seems to be both to move power up, putting it in the hands of technocracy, and to move power down to more direct democracy. How do you imagine this working, and how would you move power down? Technocracy moving power up, democracy moving power down. I think there's a very interesting question. Philosophers have always worried about democracy in some way, that democracy can be too short-term, people always putting their own interests above the interests of their children and the long-term future, and being too dependent upon the will of the crowd. And they've always tried to create some balance between, on the one hand, representing the people, and on the other hand, creating some structure for long-term thinking. And I think if you look at the United States, you can say it has some of the defects of democracy that everybody always feared, particularly the House of Representatives, Congress. And if you look at California, you can see that as well with the initiative process, that it seems to be too focused on the short term, it seems to be too angry, too volatile. On the other hand, if you look at the European Union, it seems to be too technocratic. The people don't really count, they can go and vote, they can troop out in huge numbers, it doesn't make any difference. All the decisions are made by technocrats in Brussels. And I think there's truth in that, and I think there's absolute truth in getting the importance of getting the balance right. What we tend to argue is that you should have certain things contracted out to independent institutions, particularly central banks, which look at money. Don't let politicians print money in order to get themselves elected. And since the central bank revolution took place in the 1980s, we've seen inflation essentially squeezed out of the system. That was a very good change. We also believe that you should have certain commissions which look at entitlements and begin to look at entitlements from the point of view of creating long-term balance. And I think the reason for that is that if you have a purely democratic system, it's a system which enables the current generation essentially to rob future generations, because future generations don't have votes. So you need to take into account the long-term health of the system, the accounts of people who are going to be affected by current decisions. So in Sweden, there was a big commission, non-partisan commission of senior politicians who looked at the system and said, this is how we will bring entitlements in balance, raise the retirement age and things like that. And we think that sort of thing would work extremely well in the United States with Simpson Bowles and the rest of it. It would have been a much better system if that had been passed. So technocratic solutions or solutions of bringing in wise men and women looking in the long term, not allowing everything to be voted on. But on the other hand, we also believe that you mustn't have too many things decided by technocrats, or the system loses its legitimacy, people lose their voice, they lose their ability to decide over things. So you need to be very parsimonious about what you put into the hands of these organizations. And we also believe very firmly that you need to transfer as much power down as possible to the lowest possible level of subsidiarity. You've always done that in the United States. It's one of the glories of the United States that states and cities can be centers of decision-making and centers of innovation. We've argued very consistently, I don't know if it's powerfully, it's up to you to decide that, but very consistently in The Economist that Britain is much too centralized and we need to give more power to mayors who are elected and can be held accountable for what they do. So technocracy, to a certain degree, to restrain the worst selfishness of democracies, but never too much, or you undermine the system.
Do you take one more from here, and then we'll take one from the audience? How can the US avoid becoming a slow-growth welfare state like Europe, with self-interested voters voting for handouts, while China charges ahead economically unencumbered by similar nanny state pressures? I think that's really two questions. The first bit is how can the US avoid becoming a slow-growth welfare state like Europe? The answer is it is a slightly faster growth welfare state like Europe. With self-interested voters voting for handouts, that is certainly what you have at the moment. You continue to have a system where you tax as if you were a small government country on the whole, because although you have high tax rates, you have all these wretched exemptions. And you tend to spend as if you were a big government. And at some point, the reckoning is going to come. And it's true, we're clear about this in the book, we're very tight on this, on the fiscal arguments. It's true that the budget deficit does change a bit according to growth does help in various areas, but just look at discretionary spending. If you knock out all the entitlement, all the interest payments you have to spend, that is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and ever more difficult to deal with. And so America, in the end, we think, does face a crunch, is already facing it. Some of the problems with the veterans' hospitals, which I was rude about earlier, there's a good column by Bill Galston today in the journal about it. Some of those problems are to do with the fact there isn't enough money going to the main discretionary programs because of it. In terms of the second argument about China, the nanny state powering ahead, we have to be careful about that. This book we try to pose questions to Western democracies, but we do not shirk from the idea that China comes with a lorry load of problems. And one of them is the basic idea that authoritarian model is beginning to run into natural barriers. It's beginning to run into barriers to do with people from below, beginning to ask questions in, dare I say it, in a somewhat Californian way. I remember going to one particular sort of factory in China with an American businessman, and we were walking along with the mayor, and the mayor basically said, look, right now we're quite happy bulldozing down houses to build a motorway towards your factory. That won't be the same in 10 years' time because people are getting angry. If you look at the Weibos, you look at all the complaints there, Chinese government at the bottom level does not work that well. People are furious about their schools, they're cross about what the hospitals are getting. And the other huge problem, very self-obviously, is inequality and fairness. The Roll Call, the sister publication, The Economist, had a poll earlier this year where they said, look at the US Congress, the top 50 people, the wealth of those people was 1.6 billion. Cue terrible, statements all over America, how awful it is, how rich and completely devoid of principle are our Congress people. Top 50 in America, 1.6 billion. We went to go and look and see what China was, 96 billion. That may say a lot about the ingenuity and brilliance of the Chinese politician. But that is just the published worth. It does not include any of the money which may or may not be associated with people very close to the main families, which is the sort of dirty money. So by any measure, this is a monumentally unequal country and has to deal with it. So on both the questions of those two things, I come back. Adrian, do you want to do one from here and then do...
What do you think of Jeff Immelt's call that due to the abject failure of central government, the time is now for corporations like GE to take a more active role in delivering more to society and acting on issues in the absence of regulation. Well, I don't know if Jeff Immelt has ever said exactly that, but let me talk a little bit about that subject. I think that we shouldn't be expecting corporations just to run society. I think that corporations are in the business of, if they're GE, making aeroplane engines or making medical devices, that's what they should do. And you can't just go in and say, we'll run the schools as well. That's a distraction to them. But I do think that it's important to bear in mind something called the purchaser-provider split, that governments are the purchasers. They should make sure that services are free or provided to people they're supposed to be provided to, that schools are there, that police forces are there, that hospitals are there in the public aspects of the health system. But that doesn't mean that they have to employ everybody. It doesn't mean that everybody who works in those things has to be a government worker. And I think quite often the best way to provide those services is to contract them out or allow competition between various providers to provide those services. Particularly, as I said, the Swedish example is a very interesting one. I went to a hospital in Stockholm called St. Gorans, which was it was a public hospital. Everything is free at the point of use. It was an integral part of the welfare state of Sweden, which is a very successful welfare state, but it was owned by a private equity company. And all of the doctors there were employees of this private equity company. They had incentives, they had cash bonus schemes to encourage them to hit certain targets. And they told me that they could do everything that they could do as public employees, but that two things were added by this element of private ownership. One is that doctors tend to be guild workers. They tend to operate according to long traditions that they've learned in medical school. And by running them as part of this private company, they were able to introduce them to various management techniques. They had basically lean manufacturing techniques, total quality management techniques, making the doctors feel part of a team, making them work with nurses, making them work with the whole administrative system, even doing things like making sure that there were enough taxis there to look after the patients and to take them home when they were finished. So they focused on the whole management of the hospital and made the doctors think more consciously of the management of the hospital, total quality management. So that improved things. And also, they realized that when they had worked out various improvements in the way that this hospital would work, they could spread them across any hospital that was owned by this private equity group. So they could spread them right across Europe. So I think there's a real argument that you can actually have the benefits of a public sector system, i.e. free access at the point of delivery, access that means that poor people will never be denied access, with the benefits of a market-based system, innovation, management, continual improvement. So I think Immelt is right.
So take one in the back, we take one, and then we come to you.
Yes. I'd like to raise a couple of points, if I may. Number one, I'd say in 20 to 30 years, looking at the demographic of this audience, everybody will be dead.
I think it's...
With few exceptions.
I think that's monstrously unfair, actually.
But
okay, keep going.
What is coming behind us in the field of education and the new citizens of the United States, the up-and-coming future leaders of this country? When I've dealt with kids for 20 years, middle school and high school, I've been through 3 wars, and I know these kids today don't know who fought in World War II. They don't know what the Civil War was about. They don't know the basics of history. And if you don't learn history, like Mr. Hitler did not, and he went into Russia, and he should have learned from Napoleon, then how do you expect an educated
that's
group
exactly an
where you don't fire bad teachers to come up with progressive ideas?
Why don't we take that one, and then, because we've also got a question here saying what should be the role of the state in providing high quality education without creating huge student debt that shackles young university graduates for a long time. Let's do that. I'll do the early education first. The answer is, what you're talking about basically in the end is people having a good education. And what we are talking about is exactly the same. But what we are arguing is that actually you want to push power down towards parents, particularly, about where they can choose their children to go. That is the whole point about vouchers. Sorry? Parents are apathetic. Parents may be apathetic in a system where they don't have much choice themselves. That's the lessons of choice in pretty much everything. Sweden, as we pointed out, was a much more socialist place, much more willing to keep people in power than the far more entrepreneurial Californians. But they did learn from it. All the lessons, if you give people the choice, like you've seen, everyone had all these things about if you gave poor black parents a choice about where to send their children with vouchers. They didn't. They really cared about it and went off and chose it. And so I think people repeatedly, you can see it's all the way across Britain where in the last 2-3 years, people have suddenly unleashed all these academies. The most unlikely people have stepped forward trying to run things. In terms of, you're the first person ever to say it was a good thing that Hitler didn't learn from, or bad thing he didn't learn from Napoleon failing to invade Moscow. Well, I can't work out which way around that would. But they didn't. You know, yes, we all learn the questions of history, and there is lots of questions about syllabus, but I don't think that's really particularly what we're on about here. We're on about government structure and what they should do. But our general view of education is hand things down, give people the choice, give people schools the choice, and then measure the results. You publish the results, and people who don't teach good history will automatically lose out.
I just don't buy this thing about apathetic parents. I must say, I used to live in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. introduced charter schools and introduced a voucher scheme, and you saw poor parents queuing up for hours and hours and hours to get their children into the best schools, fleeing from these schools where their children were imprisoned. And I think one of the things that really depressed me more than anything else about Obama's presidency is that he turned his back on the voucher school program, turned his back on the idea of giving choice and freedom to poor black children and said that you can't do this, we must have a monopoly over the system, while sending his own children to Sidwell Friends, an extremely good private school. I think that was appalling. But there is a great question here about the role of the state in providing quality education without creating huge student debt. It's a very good question. And I think that the clue to the answer to this question lies in the idea of whether you can actually improve productivity in the public sector, in the service sector. And I think we've lived in a world in which productivity in the service sector has been stagnant, so costs have continued to go up and up and up and up. And the question is whether that can change. And I really do believe that we may be in a world where we're just about to see a revolution in which huge productivity improvements in the public sector mean you can actually get better services for less cost, even potentially declining costs. William Baumol talks about Baumol's disease, where he says basically you need 4 people to play a string quartet. That will always be the case. If you're going to have listen to a string quartet, you've got to have 4 people. You're trapped in that world. Well, actually, you can now listen to the greatest players of string quartets over a pretty damn good stereo system and get virtually the same effect. I would argue you probably get a better effect because you don't have to listen to the coughing of the audience when you're sitting there. You can listen to the whole of every classical record that's ever been made. For what is the subscription to Spotify? What I'm trying to say is there is a dramatic revolution in the service sector productivity which completely blown Baumol's disease out of the water, or I should say it's cured Baumol's disease. Universities could be much cheaper now because they can do much more of what they've done over the internet. You can use star lecturers, you can use the Isaiah Berlin of their day to give great lectures on liberty or great lectures on Vico or great lectures on Herder. You can actually bring huge numbers of people into the world of education. And as I said, Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, sends his children to the Carter Academy, which is free and which every one of us can send our children to. So we're about to see a dramatic improvement in productivity.
Can I just add something there, which is going to sound sycophantic, but and I suppose it's both sycophantic and critical, is that like both Adrian and I have worked in California. Adrian, I think, came to the original Milken conference. What's interesting, you've taken an organisation like the Milken Institute, similar ones, for a very long time. It's argued for different ways in which public sector things can be provided. It's looked at the way that technology and things have gone together. And you could argue it both ways. You can say it's done a huge amount of good work. You can also produce all the stuff which Adrian and I have said about the public sector not yet getting more efficient. But I think overall, it is much more likely that when you look at most technological revolutions, you underestimate, you over-exaggerate what tends to happen in the short term. So yes, we've been talking about reinventing government for a long time, but people tend to underemphasize the long-term effect. And that, I think, strikes us as incredibly true of government at the moment. And what's just beginning to happen is that people are beginning to tell people, before you didn't really have much evidence about just how bad schools were, as we said earlier, or just how bad hospitals were. And that fundamentally has changed. So from the point of view, we would argue that there's a desperate attempt to flog the book. If you believe in the way that government could change, if you believe in exactly the reasons why the Milken Institute was set up, then this actually is, in some extent, demonstrating why this is beginning to happen across the world. We have a question here saying, what will catalyze the revolution, or will it be a slow evolution? I think we'd argue that, to some extent, we see it already happening around the place. There's an obvious way in which these things happen. Look back at history. Is that somebody appears who is at the front of things and changes things. That's what Reagan did. That's what Thatcher did. That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, rather obviously. You could argue that Barack Obama, Adrian talked about his greatest mistake, you could argue Barack Obama had actually really come out and looked at the Simpson-Bowles Commission and embraced it. I think he will probably look back at his presidency and say that was the single biggest domestic mistake. Because people are going to look back at this period and they're going to talk about the Bush-Obama years, where there was this huge problem and nothing was done about it. If Obama had done that, not only would he have done an amazingly good thing for America on the whole, you can argue about some of the details, but on the other hand, he would also have actually completely skewered the Republicans. So it was a double whammy in terms of that. So yes, somebody at the front can do things. From a European point of view, I look at Angela Merkel. I would argue, and I spend a lot of time wandering around the world meeting leaders, she is the most impressive politician on the world stage at the moment. By far the most adroit in terms of the way she handles very, very difficult coalitions. And yet it is, and she's also brilliant in analyzing the problems. She is somebody who said, look at Europe. It accounts for 7% of the world's population. It accounts for 20% of the world's economy. And yet it accounts for 50% of the world's welfare spending. She knows what the problem is. And yet again, apply my 20-year test. People, I think, will come back and look at her and ask the question, you were the woman who had built up this fantastic reservoir of power, and yet you didn't use it to push through the sort of changes that Europe, above everything else, does need. So leadership, a powerful leader is one way. The second way, as Adrian mentioned with Sweden, is just a bust. And that is something which is hard to believe in some ways for America, but if you start looking at things like discretionary spending, you can imagine that beginning to become a very big thing. You saw that happening in California to some extent. The third way, which again goes back to places like this, but also goes back to cities, and in the end goes back to people like you, is from the bottom. That bottom-up revolution, very much, that is what this feels like. It feels like something where cities are actually doing very interesting things. You look at what's happening in individual bits of America, there are interesting things going on. If you look at what's happening in provinces in different areas, some ones in Quebec, not Quebec, but up in Canada, bits of Europe, some very, very clever, smart things are happening. But in the end, actually, a lot of it, I think, will come from people at the bottom. It will come from people like the gentleman who left, sadly, looking at his school and just wondering, how the hell did we end up in a position, not just that California, you're spending more money on schools, and it's not just Finland you've fallen behind, it's Poland. They're the most extreme examples on the international scale. But it's also about looking at your individual district and saying, why the hell is our school so much worse than the one next door? And it's that type of comparison, which the internet does make very much easier, which makes a dramatic difference.
Yeah, I think data makes a huge difference, just public data that shows how the performance of your system compares with other people's. How can we constructively shrink government equitably with so many competing constituencies? A very difficult question. There's always a big question of whether you can actually reform democracies, whether democracies are incredibly controlled by and embedded in interest groups. And I think one of the ways in which you can do it is by using some sort of technocratic system, by asking certain people, giving certain people the power to lift their heads above the day-to-day business of being elected, the day-to-day business of running for office, and asking them as agents to look for longer-term solutions. As I say, we did that with central banks, and that stopped governments printing money to buy elections. I think you can also do it with entitlements. So I think that gets you above the level of constituencies begging for things. I also think that in the end, Churchill, and we're two English people standing here, so we have an obligation, it's part of our passport, to quote Churchill in every speech we made. But Churchill once said that America, you can always rely on America to do the wrong thing before eventually doing the right thing. And I think that's true of democracies. Democracies do the wrong thing over and over again, and then eventually they start doing the right thing. And you do get, as we saw in Sweden, as we may be seeing now in India after years of rather failing Congress Party rule, a shock which says we've actually got to bring this system under control and start combating the interest groups and looking at the longer term interests of the country.
And one question in the back, and then this is our last one.
Good afternoon.
Familiar person.
When you talk about America, I think one of the questions obviously is to consider the demographic changes where the majority of people in America will eventually have come from Asia or Latin America, and how that reflects in the future. In this state, this was the first state where more than 50% of the children born were of Latin American ancestry beginning in 2000. And so how does that factor in your thoughts, one? Two, as 60% of the world's economy moves to Asia, why should we assume leadership from other parts of the world, since that's where most of the world's economy will be? And three, the challenge of an educational system where certain unions are so of significant influence that we're seeing today. One, dramatic changes in leadership in New York, and two, even Hillary Clinton's campaign, or let's just, current statements are now focusing increasingly on rich and poor, the unfair nature of what's occurred, and if she is the leading candidate for president, and they've determined that this is a strategy that can get you elected president in a country that has one of the two lowest median net worths of any developed country on earth. How do you see the catalyst that's going to make this next revolution occur?
Shall I deal with, I'll deal with the last one, and then we'll try and take the other two or three as rapidly as possible. I think in terms of the Hillary Clinton question, the question of fairness, it's like what I said earlier, a different version of what I said earlier. If you wander around and you talk to world leaders, you tend to get the same answers. You ask their problems. They will say, I've got the economy, and some of them mention government as well, but then the second problem pretty much always is some version of fairness. And I think I used that phrase from Herb Stein earlier, which is, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Now, you have actually, not least the Institute here, has done a lot of work on inequality. As from an economics point of view, I can argue there are all sorts of reasons why inequality should not matter as much as it should do. If you look at the world is actually less unequal because all those emerging markets are coming up. If you look at things within countries, most of the economic evidence, as long as you keep things going ahead, it doesn't matter if some people get further ahead. But the very big political reality, encapsulated by the Piketty book, amongst other things, is that politicians just feel this on their neck, and that is what Hillary is feeling at the moment, is anyone who doesn't go on about inequality and fairness is in trouble. And actually, from a broad business viewpoint, I think that is something which people will have to take into account. You're likely to have a more redistributive agenda from that particular side of society. You're likely to have a much broader sense, an attack on fairness, and Hillary is trying to straddle that issue at the moment. But I think it strikes me you can either set it up as a sort of right-left thing, but there are these two things that simply will not go on forever. One is you cannot keep on having mounting inequality. There has to be something which comes to that, and that tends to be something where the state might get more redistributive. The other bit is what we're talking about. I suppose to that extent we're an alternative to Piketty. is it's also true. It would be very good if we were alternative to Piketty in terms of book sales, but it's also true that government cannot go on like it is forever. There is no way that it can just keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a classic piece of Herbstein. So the two, to some extent, balance each other. So Hillary, I think, the other very obvious point about Hillary is that what we're talking about is a problem. We talk about the right problem. It's also a huge problem for the left, because the left is stuck with this basic choice, which we desperately wish Hillary would come down on the right side of, which is, do you try and protect the poor? Do you aim public services at the poor? And the schools thing is an absolute perfect example of this. Or do you try and protect the public sector unions, who are your paymasters? And again, this is not, we have focused on America because this is America, but it's even more true of Europe. Every left to centre party, you look at the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, wholly elected by the public sector unions. Look at François Hollande. Look at where all his support comes from. Look at the left in Italy. The public sector workers have completely got hold of that side of the argument. And that is a huge frustration on that. So that's one of your questions. Adrian can do education.
We're seeing one of the greatest transfers of wealth in human history, that the wealth is shifting very dramatically from the rich world to emerging markets. You're seeing a huge number of emerging markets growing very quickly and becoming prosperous countries. And what we're seeing now is a competition between two different economic models, which those emerging markets could choose. Do they choose the model of Western democracy or Western liberalism, or do they choose the alternate competing democracy of top-down, authoritarian, Mandarin-led modernization, which is there in China? And as I wander around the world, I'm very struck by the number of people in growing emerging countries which say, actually, the model we want to base ourselves on is China, not America. You go to India, you listen to what Modi is saying now. Almost immediately after he was elected, he said, we want to be more like China. We want to be able to achieve the sort of infrastructure growth that China has got. If you go to Nigeria, if you go to Kenya, if you go even to South Africa, you get people saying, actually, the state capitalist, guided guardian state of China is the one that really attracts us. And there are two reasons for this. Partly that China has grown incredibly fast, and that is attractive to people, but partly that democracies, particularly America, but also Europe, have become lazy, self-indulgent, and paralyzed. So people look at America and they say, wait a minute, they can't even pass a budget, let alone build a new airport every year or build a new highway system every year. They look at Europe and say, wait a minute, Europe is democratically dysfunctional, nobody really likes it, we don't really want that model. And the contest of the 20th century, the great contest of the 20th century, is not really to see who comes out on top economically in some ways or politically. It's to see who comes out on the top ideologically. Will we continue to make attractive to the people all around the world the values of freedom and the values of democracy, or will we lose that contest and to the Chinese, who are talking about their own sort of top-down modernization? I think what's absolutely vital here is that we make government smaller, we make government more focused, we stop it sprawling, precisely in order to salvage and to reinforce and to strengthen the values of democracy and the values of liberty, which are at the heart of our political theory.
The last point, I'll just do very quickly the demography point. I think actually on the question of Latinos and Asians, I see that makes an enormous amount of difference to America and the way in which it's constituted. It's made an enormous amount of difference to California. I don't think it makes a difference to what's happening to the state. Well, it makes it indirectly, because more young people coming in gives America a huge advantage over Europe to some extent when it comes to government finances. But overall, it's still the same. It's demography in the sense of elderly populations, which are going to drive a lot of pressure on us. Young immigrants coming in makes a difference. As Mike said, that there is an element whereby, if you look at everything we've said, you could argue, look, Asia is the bigger countries. They're an area where they should do well. But as Adrian reminds us, I think it's important that we win the argument, because what matters gigantically in places like China is, China is beginning to come up at the same levels of GDP per head at which South Korea and Taiwan went democratic.
Absolutely.
But the difference is when South Korea and Taiwan went democratic, you had democracy working very well in the West. At this precise moment, there isn't a lot of enticements to suggest to Chinese, wrongly from our point of view, that it goes. So from all our points of view, I think we would argue that this is a great competition. And this book, for better or worse, is an attempt to try and remind the West that it is stuck in that competition. And therefore, by purchasing, you will help that great revolution. But anyway, we will
Do you want
we
to
will leave on that.
If you want to win the ideological struggle, buy the book.
Let's give a warm round of applause. Thank you very much, gentlemen.